Good afternoon, students. Today I will be lecturing on Interview 5 from A Refutation of Moral Relativism. In this interview, we get two arguments for relativism. These are arguments that Libby is giving, and Isa is going to help clarify some of the arguments, and then, of course, he's going to be criticizing those arguments. What I'll do here is what I've been doing so far, except we're going to get a lot more arguments with premises and conclusions. So you need to make sure that you're writing them down in a step-by-step format. So you write down number 1, and then you write down what I say, number 2, then write down what I say, and so on and so forth. It might be a good idea to leave a couple spaces between those steps if you want to make notes on those steps, or however you want to do it. I'll be talking about the steps as well, so you want to make sure that you write down the argument and also write down what I say about those steps. I'll be criticizing Isa at various points. I'm not sure if I do that today, but you'll want to write those criticisms of him down as well if I think his argument or his reply is lacking in any way. I'll let you know that. Sometimes I might think something is lacking and I don't say it. I'm waiting to see if you will make a point of that in your reading reviews or in the comments on the blog or something along those lines. I definitely want you to be thinking about these things on your own, independently of these lectures, but also, of course, you need to know the lectures because I give you a lot more information in here than you get in the book. And I skip things that are in the book, and that's an indication that I don't think those things are very important. Okay, so we get two arguments for relativism. The first one we're going to call argument 1. This is an argument for relativism, and it's the argument from consequences. So Libby's going to argue that relativism has some consequences that imply that absolutism has some consequences that imply that absolutism is false. So here's the general argument from consequences. So in your notes you might write general argument from consequences. And it goes like this. Step 1, absolutism has really bad consequences. Step 1, absolutism has really bad consequences. Step 2, if some theory has really bad consequences, then the theory is false. Hence, absolutism is false. That's step 3. Let's go through that again. Step 1, absolutism has really bad consequences. Step 2, if some theory has really bad consequences, then the theory is false. 3, hence, absolutism is false. Now, in general, this argument isn't a very good one, and it's not a very good one because the argument actually assumes the truth of moral absolutism. In other words, the only way the general argument from consequences works is if moral absolutism is true. So Libby's giving an argument against moral absolutism that actually requires the truth of moral absolutism. That's really bad, right? So the argument doesn't work. And the reason it assumes moral absolutism is because it assumes that bad consequences are really bad. They're not just bad according to me or bad according to my culture or society, but they're bad for everyone, whether we believe they're bad or not. Libby wants to say, these are bad consequences. Even if you disagree with her that they're bad consequences, she's going to say, no, they really are bad consequences. But that presupposes the truth of moral absolutism. You can't say this has really bad consequences, and the consequences, these are objectively bad, and yet deny that there is such a thing as objective badness. So this is, in general, this is a bad argument. Nevertheless, it's still worth looking at some of the particular instances. So go back to step 1. Step 1 says absolutism has really bad consequences. Let's look at those. I'm going to focus on one of the bad consequences. Libby actually gives a few of them. She gives as a bad consequence that moral absolutism implies self-righteousness. She thinks that's a bad consequence. I'm going to ignore that one. She says that moral absolutism implies guilt. That's the one that I'm going to focus on, okay? I think that one is more interesting. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time focusing on that. So let's look at her defense, right? So she's got this first premise in the general argument, absolutism has really bad consequences. Okay, so her defense of that is to look at guilt. And she says that so you've got the general argument. The general argument had two premises, one conclusion. Now we're going to look at a defense of that first premise in the general argument. So this is defense of first premise in the general argument. Step 1, moral absolutism causes guilt. Step 2, guilt is bad. Step 3, so moral absolutism is bad. 4, if some theory is bad, then that theory is false. Or if some theory has bad consequences, then the theory is false. 5, therefore, moral absolutism is false. I'll go through that again. Step 1, remember this is a defense of the first premise in the general argument. Step 1, moral absolutism causes guilt. Step 2, guilt is bad. Step 3, so moral absolutism is bad. 4, if X is bad, then X is false. Or if some theory has bad consequences, then the theory is false. 5, hence moral absolutism is false. Okay, so that's an attempt to reconstruct this first part of Libby's argument against absolutism and for moral relativism. Okay, so Isa gives a number of responses here, and I'm going to talk about those and go into maybe a little bit more detail. The first reply, now these are replies to that defense of the first premise, okay? So the first reply is that it's just false that if a theory has bad consequences or something like that, or if it makes us unhappy, then the theory is false. So that's a false claim. So the claim is this: if you've got a theory and the theory makes people unhappy or uncomfortable, or in general, if it's got consequences we don't like, then the theory is false. Libby's assuming something like that. She's assuming that if a theory makes us unhappy or we don't like it or it makes us uncomfortable, then the theory is false. And that claim, that if-then statement, is a false claim. Lots of theories have consequences that we may not like, and that does not imply their falsity. So for example, if you're a Christian, you think that at least Orthodox Christianity believes that there is such a thing as hell. Well, hell's going to make a lot of people unhappy if it exists. Our being unhappy with the existence of hell does not imply that there is no such thing as hell. You might think that in order for nations to exist, there has to be something like taxation. I pay taxes every year. I don't like paying taxes. I don't enjoy doing it. It doesn't make me happy. It makes me unhappy sometimes. And so my not liking paying taxes does not mean that the idea that nations require taxation is somehow false. It may very well be true. I suspect it is true that in order for nations to exist, there has to be such a thing as taxation. I don't like taxation. Nevertheless, that does nothing to negate the truth that in order for nations to exist, there has to be something like taxation. So, in general, the claim that if a theory makes us unhappy or uncomfortable or has bad consequences, then the theory is false, that claim is itself false. Okay. Second reply to the argument is it's just false that moral absolutism implies something that is bad, that it implies, and in particular, it's just false that guilt is bad. And here's the reason that Isa gives, and this is profound if you really think about it. If you agree with Isa, you're going to think that this is a really important thing. If you disagree with Isa, you'll think that this is a bad consequence. We'll talk about that in just a second. But the idea is guilt, Isa says, is like pain. And pain, physical pain in particular, but emotional pain as well, is a warning signal, he suggests, right? It tells us when things are going wrong, when things are not as they should be with our bodies. It's like the check engine light in your car, right? So the check engine light in your car goes off. That's a good thing to have a check engine light because it tells you something in the car is off. Something needs to be fixed. Get it checked out. Pain, physical pain in particular, is very much like that. It's a bodily warning signal that something is going wrong with my body and I need to attend to it. I need to pay attention to that thing. Get it checked out. It's the check engine light of our body. Pain is like the check engine light of our body. An interesting thing that I've studied on and I've published and written on this is a particular ailment called congenital analgesia or analgesia, and or it's also called congenital insensitivity to pain. And so there are persons who are born whose physiological makeup, in particular, there are these pain receptors in our brain. They're turned off, and so they don't experience physical pain. And virtually all of the people who are born with this particular genetic disease die before they reach their teenage years. It's very difficult for them to continue living. All sorts of fascinating cases. If you want, Google congenital insensitivity to pain, and you'll see fascinating cases. And the idea is this, that without physical pain, we never know when our bodies are going wrong, when there's something wrong with our bodies. And so we end up really damaging our bodies very, very, very badly. The persons who have this particular disease damage their bodies beyond repair. And as I said, most of them die at very young ages. And so the idea is similar, that guilt is necessary in order for us to live healthy lives, healthy emotional, healthy spiritual lives. And that if we didn't experience any kind of guilt, this would also lead to a kind of soul death, emotional death, spiritual death, psychological death. Right? We would be very similar to, say a psychopath or something like this. Right? Someone who can't experience guilt, who never experiences guilt, is someone that we're not certainly. If you don't experience guilt over any of your actions, I don't care to be in your company. I definitely don't want to be friends with you, and I'd prefer you not to be a part of my social group. You're a dangerous person, and more importantly, you're dangerous to yourself. Right? There's no self-repair that you'll be able to go through if you don't experience any kind of guilt. Guilt tells you, stop doing what you're doing. Rethink this course of action. Rethink these behaviors that you're engaging in. Okay, so in other words, Isa is giving a defense of guilt. He's saying guilt is not bad, right? Guilt is telling you that you're doing something bad, or that you're feeling bad, or you're thinking, the way you're thinking is bad, is dangerous. And so the idea is that pain, the experience of pain may not be pleasant, but it's a good thing for our bodies to have. The experience of guilt is not pleasant, but it's a good thing for our psychology, for our emotional life, our spiritual life to have. And so the idea then is this. Guilt makes perfect sense if moral absolutism is true. If there really are moral laws, moral rules, moral truths, moral facts that exist independently of us, then the experience of guilt says, hey, what you're doing is going against the facts, going against the truth, going against the rules and the laws that are built into the universe somehow, built into our very being. Those rules will allow you to live a healthy life. They'll allow you to live a flourishing, well-functioning life. And going against them is a kind of malfunctioning, right? It's going to result in all sorts of difficulties in your emotional, psychological, spiritual lives. And so guilt makes great sense on moral absolutism. Now, Libby is right in this sense, that guilt doesn't make good sense if moral relativism is true. So if moral relativism is true, she's right. Guilt doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would you experience guilt if we make up the rules? if we make up the moral laws, if they're dependent upon our beliefs and our desires, I would never experience guilt, right? Or if you did, you shouldn't, right? Just change the moral rules. So if you lie and you experience guilt about that, then just say, well, lying is perfectly okay. Guilt gone, right? So Libby's right that guilt doesn't make a lot of sense if moral relativism is true. Now here's Isa's major point here in this section, or the major sort of philosophical point, is that we can now see that Libby's argument is begging the question. Now this is a phrase that unfortunately has gotten mangled in our culture, and it probably is less useful than it should be, and Isa probably should use a different term here. So you can think of begging the question as a form of circular reasoning. And so we'll think of begging the question along those lines. Don't think of begging the question as an argument begs the question if it requires us to ask questions or if it's demanding questions. That's not begging the question in the philosopher or logician sense, in the sense of logic. Begging the question is a fallacy. It's a bad feature of an argument because it doesn't get the argument where the arguer wants it to go. It doesn't take us where we want it to go. So in general, here's how I will describe begging the question. Isa's discussion of this in the text is not very good. Begging the question is this: an argument begs the question when, in order to believe the conclusion, An argument begs the question when, in order to believe a premise in the argument, I have to already believe the conclusion of the argument. I'll repeat that. An argument begs the question when, in order to believe or accept a premise in the argument, I have to already believe or accept the conclusion of the argument. Okay. So in other words, an argument begs the question when the conclusion is sort of secretly lurking behind one of the premises. You can't really accept the premise unless you already believe the conclusion, and in that way the argument is worthless. The only people who are going to accept the premise, which, remember, the premise is supposed to be a reason for the conclusion, the only people who will accept the premise of a question-begging argument are people who are already committed to the conclusion, so the argument is worthless. It can't convince someone who doesn't already accept the conclusion. Here's an obvious example of question-begging. Suppose I tell you that I believe that God exists, and you say, why? And I say, because the Bible says so. And you say, well, why should I believe the Bible? And I say, because God wrote it. So my argument for God's existence is this. Premise 1, the Bible says God exists. Premise 2, the Bible is trustworthy because God wrote the Bible. Conclusion, therefore God exists. Now this is a terrible argument because it's wholly unpersuasive for someone who doesn't already believe the conclusion that God exists. Why? Because in order to accept the second premise of my argument for God's existence, you have to already believe that God exists. Okay? So that's a terrible argument for God's existence, even though I think that both premises are true. I think the premise 1, the Bible says God exists, is true. I think the premise 2, that the Bible is trustworthy because God wrote it. I think that's true. And of course, I think the conclusion is true. God exists. Nevertheless, it's not a good argument because in order to accept the premise, the second premise in particular, I have to already believe, or you have to already believe the conclusion. So begging the question is a defect of an argument. You don't want your arguments to beg the question. Okay, so Isa says that Libby's argument begs the question. Why? Because she says that guilt is bad. But it's only bad, it's only pointless, guilt doesn't make any sense only if you're already committed to moral relativism. And remember, Libby is offering this argument as a reason for believing moral relativism. So this argument should not convince anyone who isn't already a moral relativist. It's presupposing or assuming the truth of moral relativism. Okay, so begging the question is a defect of an argument. This type of defect is going to show up again and again and again. So this is why I'm sort of focusing on it fairly heavily right now. So to repeat, an argument begs the question when, in order to accept a premise in the argument, I have to already accept the conclusion. It's a kind of circularity. There's a kind of circular reasoning going on here. Okay, I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, shoot me an email or post on the blog, and I can give you some more examples of begging the question that will help you out here. By the way, if you Google begging the question, you're likely to get a lot of terrible explanations of it as well. I encourage you to Google stuff. That's fine. If you do and you include those in your reading reviews or on the final or in your paper, it has to be cited, of course. Otherwise, you're plagiarizing. But let me warn you, there's lots of garbage on the internet from people who honestly they don't have the requisite type of training in order to accurately explain some of these things. Okay. So Libby's first argument, this argument based on guilt has these bad consequences. It looks like that argument is not a good argument. All right. Let's look at her second argument then in interview number 2, or in interview number 5. Her second argument, we'll call this the argument from culture. So remember, this is an argument for moral relativism, and we'll call this the argument from culture. Step 1 in Libby's formulation of the argument. Step 1. What is right in one culture is wrong in another culture. Step 1. What is right in one culture is wrong in another culture. Step 2. This is actually the conclusion. Hence, moral rightness and moral wrongness are relative to culture. So we've got just a two-step argument from 1 to 2. Now, the first immediate reply that Isa gives, and he's dead right here, there's really no getting around this, is that Libby's argument, as it stands, is what's called a non sequitur. Non sequitur. And what that means is that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. The conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises. We need an additional premise or 2 or 3 or 50 or whatever in order to get the conclusion. At this stage, the idea is this, that step 1, what is right in one culture is wrong in another culture, that could be true. And the conclusion, hence moral rightness and moral wrongness are relative to culture, that could still be false. So you can have premise 1 true and the conclusion false. That's a bad argument. That means that the premise doesn't imply the conclusion. The conclusion doesn't follow from the truth of the premise. You could grant the truth of the premise and deny the conclusion and not be committing any kind of reasoning or logical error. So that's a bad argument. Okay, so what ICE is going to do is he's going to provide the missing premise. So now we're going to add another premise to the argument from culture for moral relativism. So now here's our new revised argument. Step 1, what is right in one culture is wrong in another culture. Step 2, moral rightness is obedience to one's culture, and moral wrongness is disobedience to one's culture. And then the conclusion, 3, hence moral rightness and moral wrongness are relative to culture. The conclusion does follow now. So this is a much better argument. It's better because if step 1 and step 2 are true, then the conclusion has to be true as well. So if you believe step 1 and you believe step 2, then you really should believe step 3. Okay. Now we're going to get some replies from Isa. What does he think of this argument? Well, of course, he thinks that this is also a bad argument, and his first reply is that the argument once again begs the question. And the reason it begs the question is because step 2, moral rightness is obedience to one's culture and moral wrongness is disobedience to one's culture, that in order to accept that, you have to already believe moral relativism. In a sense, step 2 is actually just simply a version of moral relativism. It is, in a sense, moral relativism. Moral rightness is obedience to one's culture and moral wrongness is disobedience to one's culture. That's just another way of stating moral relativism. So the only person who would accept that would be a moral relativist. So if you don't know what to think, say you're reading this stuff and you're like, man, I don't know if I should be a moral relativist or if I should be a moral absolutist. And when I read this, I try to sort of take on that position. You know, I try to say, okay, Libby, okay, Isa, convince me. And I'm not going to accept step 2 unless I'm already committed to moral relativism, so this is a bad argument. Step 2 begs the question. It assumes the conclusion of the argument already. Okay. Now I want to go into some other responses. Some of these are not in the text, and you do need to know them. So the first response is that I'd like to give is, let's look back at step 1. What is right in one culture is wrong in another culture. Now, in a sense, that this is an empirical claim, and so anthropologists and sociologists and whatnot, they investigate this stuff, and it's actually disputed amongst anthropologists and sociologists. If you're a sociology major, if you've taken some classes in anthropology and you've heard otherwise, you've heard wrongly. Empirical studies about this are contested. And so one way to look at number 1 is to say it's exaggerated at best. Number 1 is exaggerated. Oftentimes people who say what's right in one culture and wrong in another culture are actually exaggerating things. And so it's exaggerated because of this. What persons who say what is right in one culture and wrong in another culture are often sort of focusing in, zeroing in on certain kinds of moral disagreement. And what they are ignoring is the widespread amount of moral agreement. And so what you often find is that there's actually moral agreement that is spread throughout a bunch of cultures, and the disagreement involves maybe disagreement over various facts or disagreement over how to apply the areas that we agree upon. So, for example, think of the claim that murder is bad. Virtually every single culture has agreed that murder is bad, and we can just, for our purposes, let's just think of murder as the intentional killing of an innocent or someone who doesn't deserve it. Okay? So we'll think of murder along those lines. Murder is bad has pretty much been embraced by just about every culture. Now, what people dispute, what cultures dispute, is what are the cases of murder. So, for example, the Nazis believed that murder was bad, but they just didn't believe that killing Jews was an instance of murder. And perhaps they didn't believe that killing Jews was an instance of murder because they thought that Jews weren't innocent humans or innocent persons. They were guilty persons, guilty humans, or maybe they were less than human. Right? Think about the slave era in the United States. Slave masters could kill their slaves because they were property. And property doesn't have rights in the same way that humans or persons do, so they implicitly treated slaves or believed that slaves were not as human as they were. So it wasn't a case of murder. The slave owners agreed that murder was wrong. The Nazis agreed that murder is wrong. But they disagreed over how to apply that general truth, that general moral fact. And so there's and we could apply this to a lot of other stuff. There's sexual morals that have been widespread throughout culture, though some of those are changing today. Stealing, lying, dishonesty, those sorts of things are widespread throughout cultures. You get some disagreement over how to apply it. Furthermore, to say that cultures disagree with one another is going to imply, we're going to talk about this a lot later, so I'm just going to mention it here, but you don't get disagreement unless you actually are presupposing agreement, unless there's some agreement over, so for example, if I point to my table and I say, or I tell you, let's say I tell you, my table can seat 10 people. And in your culture, let's say, table means pillow, Let's say table means what our culture means by pillow, and I say our table can seat 10 people, and you say, no, that doesn't make any sense. That can't be the case. Tables can't seat 10 people. And we discover that by table, you are hearing me saying my pillow seats 10 people, then it turns out we're not even disagreeing with each other. When I'm talking about a table, I'm talking about this flat thing that people sit near during meals and whatnot. And when you say table, it turns out you're talking about something else entirely. We're not even disagreeing with each other because we're talking about two completely different things. And so this is going to be an important point. The idea is that if there really is disagreement in morality, that's going to presuppose that there's agreement in morality as well. Okay, so now, so it looks like this second argument, the argument from culture, it both begs the question, and the first premise is exaggerated because it ignores widespread moral agreement. Now, let me just say this. Even if we're wrong that there's widespread moral agreement, that really doesn't... So what? Even if premise one is true, what is right in one culture is wrong in another, even if cultures are completely different, which is, of course, empirically false, but let's just pretend it were true, that doesn't get you to moral relativism. Cultures disagree over mathematics. That doesn't get us to math relativism. Cultures disagree over evolution, biology, chemistry, physics. That doesn't get us to physics relativism, chemistry relativism, biology relativism. So disagreement, the fact that there's disagreement amongst these cultures over what counts as moral is just not enough to get us to moral relativism. Okay, I do want to talk about a revised version. Libby gives another argument, and Isa helps clarify it, and here's the revised argument. We'll call this just the new argument. I'm not going to give it a number. So this is just a new argument. Step 1, there cannot be objective truths about things that cannot be sensed with the 5 senses. Step 1, there cannot be objective truths about things that cannot be sensed with the 5 senses. Step 2, moral features cannot be sensed with the 5 senses. Step 2, moral features cannot be sensed with the 5 senses. Step 3, conclusion. Hence, there cannot be objective truths about moral features. Therefore, there cannot be objective truths about moral features. So this is an argument, again, for relativism, and it's trying to say you can't have moral objectivity. You can't have objectivity with respect to moral claims or moral features because they can't be detected or discovered via the senses. This is quite common, right? Seeing is believing. Our senses, right? If you can't sense it, if you can't discover it via some kind of perceptual observation, then it doesn't exist, it cannot be true. Now, this is a terrible argument. It presupposes, it's a terrible argument for a lot of reasons. Here's one reason. Think of the claim that if you can't detect it via the senses, then it can't be true. Think about that claim for a second. If you can't detect it via the senses, then it can't be true. How do you know that claim? Have you detected that claim through the senses? If you think that claim is true, then the only way you could know it's true is if you detected it through the senses. But you can't detect the truth of that claim via the senses. There's nothing to sense. So if the claim is true, it undermines, right? The claim, in order for the claim to be true, it has to be false. It undermines itself. You can't, it's self-refuting. Okay, here's another reason. There's lots of stuff that we can't sense with the 5 senses that nevertheless are true. So think about mathematical claims, the Pythagorean theorem, various truths of geometry, algebra, calculus, differential equations, various mathematical truths. Think about truths regarding the number 0. Think about truths regarding negative numbers. Are these detectable via the senses? In general, mathematical claims are not based on empirical observation or sensory experiences. For example, if I have 2 cups of oil and let's say 2 cups of vinegar, this chemically what I'm saying is probably false, but you'll get the idea. Suppose I add 2 cups of chemical X to 2 cups of chemical Y. I measure them, you would expect that I would have 4 cups of a combined compound chemical. But let's say instead I actually wind up, and this happens quite often, I wind up with 3.98 cups. So just via the senses, it looks like I've refuted 2 plus 2 equals 4. So suppose we actually did this experiment. I've seen the experiment done. I could do it for you. I take 2 cups of chemical X, 2 cups of chemical Y, mix them together, and we wind up with 3.98 cups. Are you now worried that 2 plus 2 does not equal 4? No, of course not, and neither am I. Right? Because I'm committed to 2 plus 2 equals 4. I know it's true via reflection on the concept of 2, the concept of addition, and the concept of equality. Right? Just by reflection on those concepts, I know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So when the chemical experiment I engage in reveals 2 cups of chemical X plus 2 cups of chemical Y result in 3.98 cups, I don't revise my math. Instead, I look for an explanation. Oh, there must have been some sort of chemical reaction that took place. And so that's why we lost a little bit of the substance, a little bit of the weight. Okay, or the volume. Okay, so there's lots of things that we know are objectively true and yet are not based on the senses. Here's some others. Isa gives some of these. God's existence, right? You can know that God exists even though you cannot sense him. How about your own mind? You can know that your own mind exists even though you cannot sense it. Isa thinks life after death. We can know that life after death is true, that there is such a thing as life after death even though we cannot sense it now. Now, of course, we can sense it later if we live after death. Love is not something that is sensed. Numbers, as I said, numbers are not sensed. Truth and falsity itself. So the fact that a claim is true, the idea of truth is not something that you sense. You don't see truth. You don't hear truth. You don't taste truth. You don't touch truth. You don't smell truth. In the same way that you don't necessarily see, taste, smell, touch, feel moral rightness or moral wrongness or moral obligation. Okay. So that new argument is also a failure. And that ends our lecture for interview number 5.